Up next, we have Zack Gray. Zack grew up in New York City and attended Columbia University, where he studied astrophysics and philosophy and spent his summers doing science research. He then joined a solar energy startup and helped it grow from small to big. Zack's speech is about the intellectual transformation that led him to Wharton. In his words, how he went from criticizing Wall Street and quoting Nietzsche to believing in business as our best vehicle for progress. If you haven't met Zack yet, he invites you to coffee and a game of chess. He says you will likely win. Let's give a round of applause for Zack.
Good afternoon. Before I say anything else, I want to thank my classmates for allowing me to speak on their behalf, and my professors, wherever you are, for putting up with all of my questions. If you knew me a decade ago, you'd probably be surprised to see me here today. Back then, I thought business just meant making money. I wasn't interested in devoting my life to money, so I wasn't very interested in business, and by the time I got to college, I'd become one of its biggest critics. My freshman year, 8 million people around the world died of cancer, and one of them was my father. Yet, instead of working on a cure, all of the smartest people I knew were running to work on Wall Street. I had heard about the invisible hand of capitalism, which supposedly leads us through our own self-interest to do what is naturally best for society. As far as I could tell, the invisible hand was broken. Well, that was one of my lines. So I spent my days doing science research, my nights quoting German philosophers and ruining everyone's dinner conversation. But then I noticed something interesting. While the heads of my lab went begging for funding, investors were begging to fund entrepreneurs, some of whom were working on cures for cancer. And many of those investors, it turned out, were just those smart friends of mine from college. Evidently, I had gotten the story wrong. Money was not the goal of business. It was the reward for taking risk and ultimately improving lives. If you needed other people to give you the resources, for example, money to pay researchers, you had to reward them for the risk. And unless you actually improve people's lives, at Wharton, we call them your customers, then you don't get any reward at all. Now, obviously the system isn't perfect, but it also built the modern world. After all, before we invented financial markets, we each grew our own food and lived on average to age 35. My father made it to age 59. So here I was, a decade later, a Wharton MBA in Rittenhouse Square, when I was cornered into a familiar debate, except this time I took the opposite side. She was a nurse from West Philadelphia who woke up every morning at 5 a.m. to work with the sick, and for much less than your average Wharton salary. Sure, I get it, she said. Cancer drugs are important. But why do we need more investment bankers? Can't we just have more nurses? Now, it was a fair question, and frankly, I thought she deserved a raise. But I did my best to explain. How else should we decide which biotech companies to fund? In other words, who should we trust with society's resources? And what if we pick the wrong ones? I guess what I'm trying to say, I told her, is that investment bankers help us cure cancer. Unfortunately, I don't think she was convinced. To many Americans like this nurse, like my younger self, Wharton graduates are a misunderstood bunch. Most of us don't go on to join the front lines, out in the open, fighting fires or performing surgeries. We tend to operate behind the scenes, in the control room, flipping complicated switches. And it's not easy to see what these switches actually do unless you study the long chain of events that follow. From an Excel spreadsheet, to a factory, to a happier, healthier human being. Wharton graduates of 2019. The power behind a single switch is greater than it's ever been in history, and we need your expertise. You are the operators of this great economic machine, the same one that has given us electricity, antibiotics, computers, and cars. As you consider the challenges of the 21st century, I ask you, what will you give us next? Thank you.